Welcome to The Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Flummer. In this episode, we talk with Elinor Mason about her work on taking responsibility and how it differs from other ways of being blameworthy.
Thanks for listening. I'm happy to introduce Elinor Mason, professor of philosophy at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Elinor works on a broad range of topics, including feminism, moral responsibility, and ethics. She is the author of two books, Feminist Philosophy and Introduction, published by Routledge in 2021. And the second is Ways to Be Blameworthy, Rightness, Wrongness, and Responsibility, published by Oxford University Press in 2019. One of the topics that Elinor explores in this latter book is that of taking responsibility, and we've asked her to talk with us today about that topic. So thank you for coming and welcome to the show, Elinor. Could you start by telling us a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on these issues related to moral responsibility?
Sure. Thanks for having me. So,
You're welcome.
My first sort of philosophical interest was in consequentialism.
Okay.
And that's what I wrote my PhD on. And my first few publications are all about that. And one of the big questions there is about how you define the right thing to do according to consequentialism. So is it what's actually going to have the best consequences, or what you think is going to have the best consequences, or what it would be reasonable for you to think would have the best consequences? And so these are kind of different ways of thinking about rightness. And there's a whole debate there that goes on about whether we should be subjective consequentialists, meaning, is rightness relative to what you think, your assessment of the consequences, or should we be objective consequentialists, which is the view that rightness is independent of your own viewpoint and it's more based on what's actually happening. So it struck me that these are really questions about responsibility. What kind of thing can you be responsible for, and how does it make sense to join up those concepts? And the more I thought about that, the more interested I got in that. And I realized that people in responsibility theory were thinking of rightness as something that's kind of independent of praise and blameworthiness. So they're asking questions like, can you be praiseworthy even if what you did was wrong, and so on. And of course, these aren't independent questions. So from both ends, kind of in the normative ethics literature, and then at the other end in the moral responsibility literature, it seemed like there needs to be some joining up. And so that's what I was trying to do.
Yeah.
And that's how I got interested in thinking about responsibility. And as time has gone on, I've got more and more interested in that.
Yeah. That's very cool. Well, before we ask you about taking responsibility, could you tell us about your view on the function of our responsibility practices and the rationale for blame?
Yeah. So in case your listeners are coming from this sort of from a beginner's point of view, there are really two ways to think about responsibility. So you could think of it as being based on free will, which is really a metaphysical issue. Free will being something that we would have, I'm finding it hard to put this charitably because I have so little sympathy with the view, but some kind of magical power. That's a very uncharitable way to put it. And there are people who defend it, who I'm sure your listeners will have heard talk about it in more eloquent and convincing terms. Obviously I'm not taking the metaphysical view. I don't think we have free will in a metaphysical sense. But I do think that we can have moral responsibility, and that's just a much less ambitious notion, and it's completely compatible with all of our scientific worldview, and it's compatible with us living in a kind of mechanistic universe where causation is more or less determinate. So obviously it's not always deterministic, but even when it isn't deterministic, it's not kind of determined by us as free will beings. So on my view, moral responsibility is something that we attribute to each other as part of our general interpersonal practices. So this is Strawson's view. This is a version of Strawson's view that moral responsibility is really about us getting along together and dealing with each other. And there's nothing mysterious about it. And if we want to theorize it more, what we're basically doing is picking out some aspect of the causal chain that led up to us acting and saying that's the bit that's important. So I have a lot of sympathy with Frankfurt's account of this, that what we think of as being the acts that we're responsible for are the ones that are connected with our concept of a person. So what is it to be a person? It's to do certain things, to have certain attitudes to the things that we do. And so it's that aspect of the causal chain that we pick out. So that's my overall view. I'm a compatibilist. I'm a naturalist. I think that we're doing, so I call it in my book, normative responsibility theory. We're figuring out something that's in a way akin to ethical theorizing. What makes sense overall for us to say about what we're responsible for? And there's no metaphysical fact of the matter there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. So the final chapter of your book, Ways to Be Blameworthy, is about the topic of today's episode, namely taking responsibility. You argue that by taking responsibility for something that the agent did, even if the agent didn't act wrongly and didn't act with ill will, the agent can become blameworthy in a certain sense. Before we ask about the details of taking responsibility, could you briefly sketch the different ways to be blameworthy in your view?
Yeah. So the first and I think primary way that ordinary people like us get to be blameworthy is by failing to try hard enough to do well by the values that we basically share. So just to fill that in kind of briefly, it's a version of the subjective rightness view. By that I mean you're acting rightly when you do what you think morality requires.
Mm-hmm.
So when you do what seems right to you. But we don't want a fully subjective view because that would allow completely crazy accounts of what morality requires. So I think that there is something that anchors our account of subjective rightness, which is that it has to be that you have roughly the right view of morality. So I think that we all do. I mean, ordinary people do. And we might disagree about some things, but when we try to resolve those conflicts, those disagreements between us, we're basically appealing to the same overall set of values. So take disagreements between Kantians and consequentialists. I don't think that they're on a completely different page. They have a rough sense of what matters, and roughly they're on the same page. So on this account, they're in the same category of getting morality roughly right, much as they'd probably hate to hear me say that. So I think that you act subjectively rightly when you are trying hard to do well. So it's not really based on your beliefs, it's based on your efforts. It's about trying. And I think for most of us, that makes sense. Most of the time, we're trying somewhat. Often, we're not trying hard enough. And sometimes we fail to try completely. And that's when we're acting subjectively wrongly. So obviously, that leaves the question of the people who don't share those values and what do we say about them? And so this is the second way to be blameworthy. I think that you can be blameworthy just for having the wrong set of values. And it isn't the same kind of thing because it could be completely not your fault at all that you've got wrong values. So if you've got the wrong values, it can be bad luck, but nonetheless, we're still going to take some kind of negative attitude to you. I think it's just important to notice that that's a different kind of thing. And so again, I really get this from Strawson. We take something like the objective stance. So we don't think that people who come from a very, very different value background are failing to try. We don't think that we can really communicate with them, though. We don't think that we can really change them. So I think that our attitude isn't blame in the same sense. Our attitude is something that doesn't communicate. It doesn't require an answer. I think our ordinary blame does. I think that when we blame people who do share the broad value set, who do share our broad concept of morality, we are trying to communicate with them. So when we blame them, we're kind of saying, hey, what did you do? Why did you do it? Tell me, speak for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas when we blame people who are totally outside of morality, as we think of it, then we're saying something more like, ooh, stay away from me. I don't like this. I object to this. I protest it. So I think that there are various accounts of blame in the literature that I can draw on here that we would apply to these people. So those are the two kinds of blameworthiness that I talk about in the first sections of the book. Ordinary blameworthiness, which depends on trying, and what I call detached blameworthiness, which applies to people who are kind of outside of our moral community.
Yeah. How extreme does a person's stance on morality have to be for us to put them outside of the moral community?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's a really tough question. It's something that I leave a little bit vague in the book. And I think that there is really a vague borderline in a way. But basically, I'm thinking of very extreme cases. So the example I use in the book is a fictional example, which is Susan Wolf's Jojo. Jojo is he's a dictator, and he's raised by a dictator, and he has a very closed environment, and he doesn't recognize the value of humanity or the value of sentient beings or the value of fairness. So that's the kind of thing I'm thinking of, those very extreme cases. Right. And of course, there will be borderline cases. And of course, we don't always know what's going on with somebody from their action. And people can change, people can learn. If we brought Jojo to a civilized university and taught him morality, he might improve. He might not, So, and we don't know sometimes whether these people who are outside of morality are just hardwired to be like that, or if it's just bad education, and what are the effects of changing education. So, I don't really have a good answer to that. But I think that most of the people that we know are, the people that we hang out with every day. We don't often encounter people who are outside of our moral community. And when we do, I think it's a shocking thing, but it does happen.
All right. We're ready to move on to taking responsibility now. So what does it mean to take responsibility, and how does it differ from maybe taking liability? And can you give us a few examples of cases in which an agent takes responsibility?
Yeah, so it might be worth just disambiguating the phrase a bit. So when we talk about taking responsibility in the sense of taking on an obligation, and that's not what I mean. So we take, for example, we would say, oh, I'll take responsibility for the drinks at the picnic. That's not what I mean. Right. We also use the phrase taking responsibility to refer to liability, to accepting liability. So, I might say, I borrowed your car and I scratched it, but I will take responsibility for the repairs, meaning I'll accept liability for it. So even if it wasn't my fault that the car got scratched, it got scratched when it was parked in a car park, nonetheless, I accept liability. The car was in my possession. That seems like a fair way to assign liability. So liability doesn't depend on the thing being your fault. It just depends on it being connected to you in some way. Like if your pet does something, you're liable. Or if your kid does something, you're liable. So when I'm talking about taking responsibility, I'm not talking about mere liability. I'm not talking about kind of voluntarily taking on liability. I'm talking about something closer to our conception of basic responsibility or fundamental responsibility, that I make it my act by taking responsibility. I make it the kind of thing that I'm genuinely blameworthy for, in a special way, of course. This is a third kind of blameworthiness. Right. It's not the same as either of the other two kinds. But I think that we can become blameworthy and responsible by deciding to, or having a disposition to, more commonly take on responsibility.
That makes sense. And you can see how it's different from even the second of the ways of being blameworthy, which is different from the sort of ordinary way of being responsible. So you make the case for thinking of taking responsibility for some unfortunate outcome as involving remorse, which you take to be sort of between guilt and agent regret. Could you explain these concepts and say why you think remorse is most appropriate when an agent takes responsibility?
Yes. So the idea of agent regret comes from Bernard Williams. And he is talking about moral luck. So he's talking about a case where there's a bad outcome, but in a sense, it seems just like bad luck that this outcome came about. And yet, it's also in some way on you. So his example is a lorry driver. So that's a truck driver in the American parlance who accidentally kills somebody and they haven't done anything wrong. So they didn't fail to check their brakes, let's say. But through complete bad luck, they kill a pedestrian. So what do we say about that case? Williams points out that it would be odd for the lorry driver to have the attitude that it was bad luck, it's not on them, it's nothing to do with them. The lorry driver ought to feel something. Now, not guilt, because the lorry driver didn't do anything wrong. So they ought to feel agent regret. So this is Williams's way of capturing that sense we have that when you are the cause of something bad, even if you're not the agent of it, even if you didn't do it deliberately, it makes sense for you to have some kind of emotional reaction. And that seems right to me. So I definitely think that there are cases where agent regret is, totally the appropriate thing to feel. Right. But I think that there are many cases, and perhaps Williams's own case is one of them, where what we ought to feel is something stronger than that. So it's not guilt. It's not guilt because guilt involves this thought, I did something wrong and I shouldn't have done it. And if we do something inadvertently, or if we're the cause of something without having made a decision about it, then obviously it wouldn't be appropriate to have the feeling or the thought, I shouldn't have done that. It doesn't make sense. So what is there between agent regret and full-on guilt? Well, remorse, it might be said, has the same feeling and the same thought as guilt. So you might think that remorse also involves this thought, I shouldn't have done it. And I do think that that's often the way we use that word. And so in that sense, I'm not latching on to exactly our ordinary concept here. Sure. And so it's not quite the right word. I really need to invent a word, but I haven't quite managed to do that. So here's a way to put it. There are shades of agent regret, and they lead up to remorse, and then they lead on to guilt. And perhaps just before remorse, there's something which is this sick feeling of, it was me that did it. It was a bad thing, and I am implicated in that. And it was something that I should feel bad about, and I do feel bad about it. So it doesn't involve the thought, I shouldn't have done it. At least it doesn't involve that thought insofar as that thought has the implication that you were in control of it. But I think we do sometimes have a thought that's a little bit like, I shouldn't have done it, even when we don't think that we were totally in control. So one of my examples is implicit bias. So the literature on implicit bias tells us that we sometimes act out our biases without realizing it. We don't do it deliberately. And maybe we don't even do it with a kind of bad will that we're disguising from ourselves. Maybe it's something that's much more automated, something that's just more built into our systems. So, as calculating machines, we have a whole load of heuristics, and we develop those without conscious input. we're just responding to the world, and quite possibly we end up with implicit biases that really that don't involve bad will. There's a sense in which it's not our fault. They're just kind of baked into us. So imagine someone who realizes that they have been making biased decisions. They might know, and it might be true, that it's not their fault. They didn't have bad will. They didn't do it deliberately. And yet, it seems to me appropriate to feel something stronger than agent regret there. Weaker than full-on guilt, but something like remorse. Something like, yeah, I wish I hadn't done that. I did it. It was me, even though it came from an automated process that I'm not responsible for having acquired. It was me that did it. And yeah, I'm remorseful about it.
Yeah. So what are some conditions, or what are the conditions under which an agent should take moral responsibility on your view?
Okay, again, this is something which I'm a little bit vague about. So I'm not trying to provide necessary and sufficient conditions for when you should take responsibility. But the kinds of case that I talk about are cases that I label ambiguous agency. And I don't mean ambiguous in the sense of you don't know for sure whether you did it or not. It's not just an epistemic notion. I mean, it's genuinely unclear whether you did it or not. So I think of agency as having very core cases. So in the core cases, you're completely clear-eyed, you make a decision, nothing interferes with you, you execute the decision. That's core agency. But then there are lots of cases that take us a little bit further from that. So, it's widely accepted in contemporary moral responsibility literature that you're also responsible for things that you do without really making a decision, but just through the quality of your will being a certain way. So if you forget your friend's birthday, this is Angela Smith's example, you reveal the quality of your will in that, even though it's not something you decided to do.
Right.
So a lot of what we do involves the quality of will. And I think that, as I say, it's widely accepted that these are things we're responsible for, but they're a little bit further from the core of our agency. And as we move out to the kind of outer edges, we get the cases that I call ambiguous agency. So implicit bias would fall into that category.
Yeah.
It's not clearly you, but it's not clearly not you either. And I think that there are a range of cases like that. So I think that another one is what we do inadvertently. And by inadvertently, I don't mean like forgetting your friend's birthday, where there is a quality of will. I mean things that you do that are genuinely inadvertent. There's no quality of will involved. And the reason it's out in the kind of peripheral area, out in the ambiguous agency case, is precisely because there's no quality of will involved in it, in the sense of it's not down to your carelessness or lack of love or anything like that, just pure inadvertence. Nonetheless, I think those aren't things that we can just shake off. I think that they are connected with the self and agency, but in an ambiguous way, in a not very clear way.
Yeah. What would be an example of an inadvertent action that you're thinking about?
Well, the example I use in the book is losing a friend's necklace. So again, just to stress this, sometimes when I lose stuff, it's because I don't care enough about it, and then I'm blameworthy.
Yeah.
I'm imagining this as not being one of those cases. I'm imagining this as a case where the clasp just breaks and it falls and I'm distracted and I don't notice, something like that. So it's really not my fault in the traditional sense. It's not something that I did through core agency or even through, the next layer out, as I put it, which is bad quality of will. It's just an inadvertent thing. But it's my friend's necklace that she lent me so I could wear it to this event, and it's precious to her. And although it was inadvertent, it seems to me I should, and I'll come back to what I mean by should there. I'm sure you're going to ask. It seems to me I should take responsibility. I should be willing to say, yep, I lost your necklace. And that if I said to her, you know what? I've really introspected. I've examined my quality of will. I took all due care. I did nothing wrong. So this is just bad luck. And obviously, I'll accept liability and I'll do what I can to replace it. But, I got to tell you, I'm not blameworthy. This is not my fault. I'd be kind of a jerk if I did that. So that's the kind of basic should there.
That makes sense.
Being the right kind of person, being the right kind of friend requires that I am willing, in some cases of inadvertent action, to take responsibility. But notice not all cases. So, let's say I rent a car and it gets scratched, and I'm just going to look at the terms of the rental agreement and say, okay, I'm liable. But I'm not going to take responsibility. I'm not going to go into the rental car counter and say, I'm so sorry. I'm just going to say, how much do I owe you, and hand over the money.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm wondering about, this is just another follow-up question to the example of implicit bias. If someone sort of recognizes something that they're not responsible for in the traditional sense, but that's affecting their decision-making, if they come to see that and they take responsibility maybe for a biased decision that they've made, would that affect their sort of, I don't know, direct responsibility for decisions they make down the line if they're now aware of the bias and have taken responsibility for some biased decision? Thinking of like kind of how taking responsibility shapes their sort of, I don't know, direct responsibility later on.
Yeah, so I think it does. Although in a very straightforward way. I mean, I don't think this is a kind of complicated part of the theory. It's just once you've noticed you have a tendency to do an inadvertent thing, then it's less clear that it's inadvertent next time you do it. Then you should be taking more measures to prevent yourself doing it. And then you're just directly blameworthy if you don't. So if I know I tend to forget things, or if I know I get distracted and don't notice what's going on with my immediate surroundings, and that it's led to trouble in the past, then I have a duty to do better in future. And so then I'm just directly violating that obligation when I don't do it.
Right.
Yeah. This is kind of a silly example, but when I turn the water on in my garden to water it, I forget that it's on and then flood the backyard. And so it's like part of taking responsibility for that is knowing that I'm forgetful. And so now I set a timer to make sure that I can go turn it off before I flood the yard.
Right, exactly. Part of the initial example is that you've got to have taken all due appropriate measures to prevent this from happening so that it counts as really inadvertent. And once you've made the mistake a couple of times, then the measures that you should take increase. You should take more measures to make sure you don't do it.
Yeah,
so I don't think that's exactly part of the taking responsibility.
Right.
That's just part of learning from your own tendencies.
That makes sense. All right. Well, now I want to come back to the should from your earlier answer and ask, why would someone want to take responsibility? And then can agents who refrain from taking responsibility, be blameworthy for failing to do so?
Good. So I think that it's not a moral duty. So I don't think that you're blameworthy for not taking responsibility. So the reason that you're not blameworthy is that these are ambiguous agency cases. It is ambiguous. It could go either way. And we can imagine somebody who just says, you know what, I'm not responsible. That's not the kind of person I am. I had no bad will. I didn't do it deliberately. It's not the kind of thing I'm going to take on. And our thought about them would be about the kind of person they are. So what we would learn about somebody who acted like that and who thought of their own sphere of responsibility in that very constricted, limited way is just, wow, they're a very small person. So we wouldn't think they were bad. It doesn't seem morally bad. It seems more like it's the kind of person that we wouldn't want to be friends with, the kind of person we wouldn't want to marry, the kind of person that we wouldn't want to leave our kids with, the kind of person that we wouldn't want to hang out with, the kind of person we wouldn't want to lend our stuff to. So it's not that we think they're morally bad. And you can imagine such a person meeting another person who's just like that, and they get along fine because they're in complete agreement on what they're each responsible for. But most of us are not like that. For most of us, our own sense of self is more expansive, and we want to be with other people whose sense of self is more expansive. Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't want to put it in moralized terms. I don't think that taking responsibility is really a virtue. It's certainly not a duty. I think it's more about the person, the kind of person that you are and how you interrelate with other people. So it's very important, but it's important in interpersonal ways. So I guess it's a little bit like being funny. Being funny is important. Being humorous, being able to see other people's, jokes and appreciate their humorous side, but it isn't a moral issue.
Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So we've been asking questions about the material that you've explored in your published work. Has your thinking changed on taking responsibility at all since writing these works? Or is there anything you'd like to add now about your view?
Well, I've been writing about this actually, not exactly nonstop, but in little bursts since publishing the book. And something that I published quite recently, I think develops the view in useful ways. So there was a festschrift for Joseph Raz. There were 2 conferences, and the proceedings were published in a volume which is edited by Kimberly Brownlee, David Enoch, and Andre Marmor. And in that, I'm discussing Raz's account of taking responsibility. So Joseph Raz had an account of taking responsibility, in which he said that the really important thing is that you can't think of yourself as being sort of full of holes in terms of your capacities in the world. So you've got to take responsibility for your inadvertent actions. And it's about your sort of sense of self as a solid, capable person. And in that article, I think more about what it is to think of yourself as being a certain kind of person. So, I said we wouldn't want to hang out with somebody who doesn't take responsibility. We would think that they were taking a kind of overly precious view of their own responsibility. And in this more recent work, I think more about what determines how we think of ourselves. And I think it is important to recognize that it's not just something that comes from us, it comes from the world. So the world is telling us what kind of people to be. And I think that there are lots of gendered aspects to this. So I think, for example, women are told in some ways, or encouraged, or, the subtle stuff that comes from socialization. It's not like somebody telling you what to be. It's more like the world is giving you messages and the world is giving you feedback, and it's built into our social structures. So I think that women generally get the message that they are very responsible in these interpersonal, familial, domestic spheres. So women are responsible for what our children do, for what our partners do. We take it on and we feel it. We feel shame and guilt and remorse and everything about a very wide range of things. So the ambiguous agency is quite far from the core in that area. And for men, I think there's a different way in which men are given the message that they have an expansive responsibility, which is that ideals of masculinity are often related to power and competence. And so I think that men are given the message that they have to take on responsibility for how things go in the domestic sphere too, but their professional lives. You never think about, a company goes bust and a man loses his job, and that's not his fault, But I think often men are given the message that now they should feel shame and that they've lost their job and that it's their masculinity is implicated in some way. And so men have internalized this sense that they have to be always in control, always competent. So I think that sometimes taking responsibility can be a bad thing. It can be motivated by gender ideology, for example, or other kinds of ideology, or other kinds of bad idea. So we just get a bunch of bad ideas about the kind of thing we should be. And we can take it too far. So I think we should be careful about our dispositions to take responsibility. We should examine them, and we should examine them in the light of these possibly pernicious influences. But I do still think that there are lots of good ways of taking responsibility.
Sure.
So we just have to stick to the good ways of taking responsibility.
Yeah.
Well, that's cool. That's a really interesting development of the view. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Elinore. This has been a fun conversation. Where can listeners go to follow your work?
Well, I have a website, and I try to keep it up to date with papers, and that is linked through my website at UCSB, so that's pretty easy to find.
Great.
Yeah. Thanks again, Elinore.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah. In our next episode, our topic will be addiction and control, and our guest will be Chandra Sirpada, Theophile Raphael Professor in Psychiatry and Philosophy at the University of Michigan.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.